Hey everyone, and welcome to Valley of Depth, a podcast from Archaea Media. Archaea builds media brands around the critical technologies shaping national security. We do this through Payload, which covers the space industry, Ignition, which covers nuclear energy, and Tectonic, focused on defense tech, through journalism, events, and original research. With Valley of Depth, we're going deeper, talking to founders, investors, policymakers, and military leaders who are building and shaping some of the most complex and consequential technologies in the world. Today, I'm joined by Evan Rogers, CEO of True Anomaly, a space defense company building autonomous spacecraft and software for contested orbits. We talk about why Evan left the Air Force to build tech the Pentagon wasn't, what space superiority actually looks like, how China and Russia are changing the game in orbit, and why the future of space power depends on fast, maneuverable systems, not fragile billion-dollar assets. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick word about Payload Pro, our premium subscription for deep dive space industry insights, analysis on trends, and exclusive research you won't find anywhere else. Each week, we go beyond the headlines with original reporting, investor perspectives, and detailed financial models. Recent topics include SpaceX's projected 2025 financials, Kuiper's business economics, and the resurgence of satellite manufacturing. We also just published our first report, The Case for Space, a 50-page investor's guide to the space economy. If you're in the business of space or just want to understand it like an insider, subscribe now at pro.payloadspace.com. That's pro.payloadspace.com. Evan, welcome back to the show.
Mo, great to see you again. This conversation, I feel like it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, exactly. And we've known each other for, over a couple of years now, so we'll have a good time. Really appreciate you coming back on the show. We have a lot to dig into today. And though I know True Anomaly, the company you started and you're now the CEO of, isn't taking center stage today because we're spending some time talking about some other very important things. I do want to spend a few minutes on it. So maybe tell us a little bit about, what is the company mission and how are things, going today?
Yeah. True Anomaly's mission is to build autonomous systems for space superiority for the United States and its allies. That's our sole focus. So we just build the capabilities that the U.S. and its allies need to protect and defend itself in the space domain, which I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what that actually means, but also to be able to hold adversary systems at risk to prevent them from exploiting the space domain as well. And as you know, we just raised a monster Series C led by Excel with participation from Meritech and Riot and Eclipse and others. So super excited about that. And we're using those funds to invest in product and team.
Yeah, congratulations on that. Before we get to, I do want to talk a little bit about the fundraise. Tell us a little bit about how you started the company.
Yeah, so really I started the company after a 10-year career in the Air Force. I think there are a group of folks that come out of the military and they spend some time in industry or they go off and they get an MBA and those are all completely valid paths. Mine was very different. I left the military and spent exactly 12 days out of uniform before signing the paperwork to start True Anomaly. So basically took no time off. And I started the company because of my time in the military with my co-founders and my colleagues who I used to wear the uniform with. And really our job is really just to fill this gap in this defense industrial base in the United States and eventually internationally that looks like a company totally focused on space superiority. There are a lot of companies that build products that are either adjacent to space superiority or part of the ecosystem, part of the infrastructure. But there is no other company in the world other than True Anomaly that just builds for this moment when space superiority is such a critical part of global power projection for the United States.
So Evan, $260 million is a monster Series C, especially in this environment, especially how difficult it has been in general for space companies that are operating in space or startups that are operating in space. So congratulations again on that. But tell us a little bit about how the round came together and what prompted the investors like Excel, which aren't typical space investors. Like how did it all come together?
Very simply, Mo, it came together because we're a defense company and a defense company first and a space company second. Again, we started this company to build defense products for space superiority, and investors of the last 2 years in particular who have been sort of late to generate a thesis around defense have really done their homework. And we saw a big difference between investors in the Series B and the Series C in the level of sophistication of the thesis. And so by the time we went to market for the Series C, a lot of funds we were talking to had sophisticated defense theses. They understood the risks. They understood how the Defense Department buys things, how the intelligence community buys things, and the magnitude of the opportunity that I think really comes with, particularly in changes of this administration. Although, when we were fundraising in the early stages, that was not clear who was going to take this last election. And we spent a lot of time with investors leading up to a formal process, just making sure that we understood who are really viable investors that were going to go the distance with us, and then doing some education about what makes True Anomaly idiosyncratic. Even though we're a defense company and there are other defense companies that have done monster rounds in 2024 and in early 2025, there are some things that come with being a space defense company that we had to spend some time on.
Well, we'll spend a little bit more time on True Anomaly towards the end of the show, but I do want to talk about a little bit more about this idea of space superiority, space defense, strategy. It's what you spent quite a bit of your time prior to True Anomaly doing. So I want to take a step back in time for just a second. When did space become a place that we thought we needed defending? Maybe let's kind of start there. When did nations realize that defense capabilities in space was something that was necessary? Was it as early as Sputnik? I guess if you really wanted to kind of rewind the clock.
I think you can carve the evolution of space superiority and space defense, into three chunks. The first is the Sputnik era to the fall of the USSR. Then there's this intervening period between the fall of the USSR and I'd say probably 2007. And then there's 2007 and on. So the space domain has always been a domain for global strategic competition. It's a theater for the way that great powers contest each other across political, military, diplomatic, and informational instruments of power. After the fall of the USSR, the United States really lost its strategic adversary. And with the advent of 9/11, with 9/11 happening, you saw a focus in space technology development pivot from sort of mothballing a bunch of post-USSR capabilities, and certainly some alarmism, particularly from Donald Rumsfeld around the importance and the reliance of the United States on space. He led a commission colloquially called the Rumsfeld Commission, that introduced the idea of like a space Pearl Harbor. But with 9/11, we started building ever more exquisite systems. And when you build exquisite systems, they end up being very expensive. And when you have expensive systems, you can build a fixed number of them within a constrained budget, right? Well, 2007, China launched a missile called the SC-19 against a spacecraft called the Fengyun-1 Charlie. SC-19 was an anti-ballistic missile. And there's an interesting connection between anti-ballistic missile technology development and direct ascent anti-satellite weapons development. There's a lot of synergies between those two, between the booster, the guidance systems, the targeting systems, et cetera. 2007, they launched that direct ascent ASAT, generated a ton of debris, and all of a sudden, space weapons are on the world stage. And the DASAT test by China wasn't just a single blip in China's technology development for counter space weapons. It was part of a deliberate campaign to contest the United States' principal architectural and asymmetric advantages vis-a-vis the space domain. So it was the most obvious and most apparent and most sort of public display of counter space technology by China, really the first one, but was part of a broader technology development campaign that consisted of co-orbital ASATs, directed energy systems, non-kinetic systems, GPS jammers, communication systems, direct ascent anti-satellite weapons to higher altitudes. And we really saw that play out in the teens. And then in 2017, you had a very broad declaration by the United States and its allies, actually, and NATO as well, that space was a warfighting domain. Space Force stands up, and then here we are.
So a lot to unpack there. So from your perspective, were we effectively sort of space dominant post, outside of Sputnik, of course, and then, Yuri Gagarin a few years later, who became the first person to travel to space, which of course was a Soviet astronaut, or cosmonaut, I should say. Ever since then, we have been, in general, far more superior in our technology versus really anyone else. Was the 2007, do you kind of view the 2007 test, the Chinese ASAT test, as sort of a turning point for how we viewed space as a domain for warfare?
Yeah, definitely. That is actually when you saw organizations stand up explicitly for the modeling, simulation, and intelligence collection and exploitation for Chinese, but also Russian counter space weapons development programs. So that was the so-called shot across the bow. But you can actually go back to previous wars before 2007 that articulated the first space war is actually the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, because you saw the first utilization of space technologies to enable terrestrial operations. And you saw some countering by the Iraqi military, GPS jamming, those kinds of things, to prevent the United States from exploiting those technologies. So we enjoyed dominance as evidenced by the first Gulf War, but 2007 was for sure the watershed moment where we realized that we had to wake up and actually do something about it. And it kicked off a bunch of portfolio reviews, kicked off a bunch of intelligence collection campaigns that were super deliberate on space control technologies, but also the other side of the coin, which space weapons gets a lot of attention. It's very sexy, very interesting. But the other side of space superiority is also adversaries exploiting the space domain for the support of their own terrestrial operations. So collecting intelligence from space on naval systems or airfields, et cetera.
When you alluded to this a little bit in your when you were talking about your background, but when did you personally recognize that the U.S. needed a new strategy in space defense? Like, what was sort of that moment for you? Was it a specific event? Was it a war game? Something that made you feel like, wow, like we're like really unprepared?
Yeah, there were actually a number of moments. I had the good fortune of being part of a lot of war games and exercises and training events, but also served in a couple of roles that put me really on the front lines of technology development and tactics development and threat analysis. And I started to get an inkling that there was a pretty significant problem as early as 2013 in my first assignment. Traditional space operations is basically satellite administration or systems administration. Your job is to sit there and babysit the spacecraft and make sure that it all works through the missions that it's designed to go do. So spacecraft have anomalies, you're there to help fix them. But a lot of times what ends up happening, at least this is in the last decade, was you would end up calling the engineers, who built the system. So I flew a satellite called a constellation called Advanced Extremely High Frequency, built by Lockheed Martin. The frontline operators could only do so much to build or to amend the system and get into a stable state. So eventually engineers can come along and fix them. And I realized that that was not going to be sustainable in a conflict where you're not just dealing with normal system degradation, but also you're dealing with adversary action, and the normal anomaly resolution process and actions that an operator would take would be insufficient. And really from a timeliness standpoint, to be able to preserve the constellation's capacity to deliver service, whatever service it's providing. In this case, AHF is a communication system. So I started asking questions in 2013 about how I would take the technologies that were available to me, the systems capabilities that were available to me, and do something different with the performance of the capability to threat react against a direct ascent anti-satellite missile, or to detect a jamming event or a cyber intrusion event. And that received a little bit of attention, and I was asked to go to an organization called Weapons and Tactics inside of the 4th Space Operations Squadron, where I met one of my most important mentors, who introduced me to the weapons and tactics community. And then I went off to the Air Force Weapons School. So the Air Force Weapons School is, a lot of folks have seen Top Gun, so I use this. It's not exactly as my former colleagues are probably like, they're going to strangle me for making this analogy. But Air Force Weapons School is basically an advanced tactics and leadership school for company grade officers and junior field grade officers. And while I was at the Air Force Weapons School, I had the opportunity to explore an idea that had sort of emerged in my head in 2014 and 2015 while I was reading the theoretical works of John Boyd. John Boyd was a famous 1950s, 60s, 70s fighter pilot who co-developed the theory of energy maneuverability theory, often called 40-second Boyd, for his ability to achieve a tactical advantage basically in any one-to-one fighter configuration in less than 40 seconds. And what compelled me about his work was this idea that you could parameterize success and failure in a 1v1 engagement such that you could have repeatable outcomes against a similarly trained or similarly capable in this case, an aircraft, but my question was spacecraft. So I had this question about like, how would I parameterize the performance of space systems such that you could use the performance envelope that you had today to outthink and outmaneuver your adversary? And so I wrote a paper on that called Orbital Engagement Maneuvers that really made the first attempt to operationalize ideas from naval warfare and air warfare, parameterize space-to-space engagements, and then present our operators with an ability to quickly orient themselves to complex astrodynamics and tactics problems. I say all that to say that like that kind of line of inquiry really made me realize that there was a massive body of knowledge to be developed by the space operations community. I was working on a very, very small sliver of it and asking some very foundational questions. But this had to be done across the board. It had to be done, an entirely new body of knowledge for doctrine and tactics and theory had to be developed for space warfare. And I realized that you couldn't actually build the systems that were necessary to counter the threat until you had a repeatable framework for understanding success and failure in space warfare.
I want to kind of jump back to a term that was used a number of different times. So space superiority, obviously a hot topic, and it's a phrase that's commonly used, especially within the Space Force. What does it mean in practical terms? As someone who is, kind of early days in space doctrine and strategy, from your perspective, what does it mean in practical terms?
Yeah, I won't get the exact phrasing right from a recent document that came out from the Space Force, but effectively it means that blue forces, or the force of your choosing, can operate at the time and place of their choosing to deliver effects at the time of their place and choosing without the intervention of adversaries. In fact, I can pull up the formal definition. I think I actually have it here. I'll just read it to you. The degree of control that allows forces to operate at a time and place of their choosing without prohibitive interference from space or counter-space threats, while also denying the same to the adversary. So
is that definition,
two sides of the same coin.
Is that definition quite similar to superiority in the sense of any other kind of branch, call it Navy or domain of warfare, like Navy or like sea, land, or air? Like, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a phenomenal call out. Right, so the United States has a framework, a strategic framework, a military theoretic framework, through which they view the control of a domain or the achievement of superiority in a particular domain. So it's countering adversary action, being able to deploy blue forces and achieve blue effects when you choose it, rather than when your adversary is giving you necessarily the opportunity to, or when your adversary is at their strongest point. Right.
So, Evan, tell me a little bit about. Just take a step back. Like, what does space warfare actually mean in practice? Like, what does it mean? Are we are we Star Wars, like flying around shooting guns at people? Like, not to be funny about it, but like, what does it actually mean at the end of the day?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. But this is an area that actually needs to be aired out big time, because I think demystifying it will give folks an opportunity to understand like how conventional it is and root it in kind of real lives being saved and real engagements happening. So I like to approach this problem through what I call just 3 engagement phenomenologies. So the first is space to ground, the second is space to space, and the third is ground to space. So this mirrors what you see in other domains: air to ground, air to air, and surface to air, right? And there are weapons that are deployed across each one of those engagement phenomenologies. So a space-to-space weapon might look like a space-to-space kinetic interceptor, or a space-to-space directed energy weapon, like a short-range pulse laser type of thing. A surface-to-space weapon looks like a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon, or a satellite communications jammer. And then a space-to-ground weapon looks like a space-to-ground non-kinetic system, like a jammer, or a fractional orbital bombardment system, which is a spacecraft that's designed to deploy a kinetic interceptor after completing a fraction of an orbit or more than one orbit. Like the colloquial term for this is a rod from God, although fractional orbital bombardment systems aren't technically rods from God because they don't fully complete an orbit. So the other dimension of this, so there's 3 engagement phenomenologies. The other dimension, as I already hinted at, is this idea of kinetic and non-kinetic weapons. So kinetic weapons, they use kinetic energy to destroy their target. So an explosive or in other domains like penetrators or things like that, right? Anything that uses like physical interaction. And then non-kinetic weapons, which are like, sometimes you can consider directed energy net weapons, kinetic weapons, or non-kinetic weapons. I actually don't know. I'm sure somebody will correct me on this. But a laser system or a jammer, right, would be a non-kinetic system. Non-kinetic also includes typically like energetic weapons, like a tactical nuclear weapon in space, although because it's designed to go after electronics, the electronics of the system. And this is something that's gotten some attention in recent in the last couple of months, because there is a concern that Russia is starting to develop and deploy small nuclear weapons in space. And this is such an important moment, because it should disabuse the United States and the public from thinking that there is any one particular strategy that is going to solve all space defense and space superiority problems. Warfare is always a combined arms problem, which is to say you use weapons of different types deployed in the battlefield to create weaknesses that then other forces can go exploit, right? So there's no such thing as an uber weapon and no such thing as an uber strategy. Like Starlink is a really important technology, but it is not, its mass proliferation has a core weakness, right? Which means it's subject, that in this case, it's subject to a tactical nuclear weapon in the space domain. So we're always going to need multiple different weapon systems and defensive capabilities, multiple different deployment strategies, and multiple different orbits to actually solve the space superiority problem. So what that points to is this like massive set of technologies and family of systems that have to be built by the Space Force and the National Security Space Enterprise to be able to achieve space superiority.
So on just speaking practically, what does it mean for the Space Force in terms of R&D and tech development?
Well, it means, first of all, they have a ton of work to do, but also it goes back to what we were discussing around the connection between operational concepts and technologies. For a long time, the Space Force and the forces that existed prior to that were in a technology pull dynamic with industry. And still you hear some of this rhetoric and it makes sense. Like they are asking industry to bring them answers because what they're trying to capitalize on is the rapid evolution of technology coming out of industry, coming out of the private sector, right? But what that misses is the importance of operational concepts coming first or co-evolving with the technology, right? So it's not at all obvious that a carrier would be a useful technology for anything other than military purposes, right? There really are no commercial applications for big floating runways, right? For the most part. So the reason I highlight that is because the development of a carrier is about power projection, which means that it allows the United States to achieve the end states of certain operational concepts in the maritime and air domain to achieve political ends of the United States. Without those operational concepts and the simultaneous grappling of the physics of the domain, you risk not building the right system or leaving some territory of the technology envelope uncovered that might give you an asymmetric advantage in the domain. And so what we do at True Anomaly is work on those operational concepts and the technologies at the same time, so we can make sure that we're building actual warfighting capabilities and asymmetric systems tied to like the operational end state and the threat requirements, not just saying, here's a cool new widget, let me throw it over the fence to a warfighter and see if it sort of sticks against the wall.
Right. Let's talk about the Space Force. Since its establishment as an independent military branch, what has it allowed? What has that allowed it to do? Because clearly the sort of a lot of the operational processes and some of the and the sort of, call it day-to-day activities, for lack of a better word, was present within the Air Force, right? Pulling the Space Force, pulling those capabilities out of the Air Force and putting it into its own independent branch. What has that meant?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is often misunderstood because of the force of personality that ended up sort of being associated with the establishment of the Space Force. The establishment of the Space Force is all about focus. It's an acknowledgement that space is a warfighting domain. It means that funding and capabilities and doctrine and tactics and policy need to be aligned to the end of achieving space superiority. And that's an explicit mandate for the United States Space Force. So to do that, to achieve space superiority, you have to have organized combat-ready forces, organized and trained forces, and then you need capabilities that allow them to achieve whatever their end state mission is within the kind of permutations of different operations and the threat landscape that those forces will see in the battlefield as they target space systems or defend terrestrial forces from attack or defend their own systems from attack. And there's this kind of tapestry of operational concepts that sit below all of that forces measure themselves against, measure their effectiveness against. So the establishment of the Space Force allowed for the focus necessary to say, here's what space superiority is. Here are the operations that forces that support space superiority conduct. And here's the funding and technologies that need to be aligned to achieve that. Before the establishment of the Space Force, when the Space Force was part of the United States Air Force, still part of the Department of the Air Force to be clear, but was still part of the United States Air Force, funding was often allocated to different priorities. So the Air Force, the purpose of the Air Force is air superiority. And even if you amend that to be air and space superiority, when you have general officers and you have the individual incentives and the culture that's focused on air superiority, you're going to get certain budgetary outcomes that are not conducive to taking the space problem seriously. And one of the things, by the way, that was most challenging was the cultural divide between an organization that was effectively a support agency, Air Force Space Command, et cetera, and space professionals therein, becoming all of a sudden sort of pushed onto the stage to say, yeah, we're warfighters, and dealing with the kind of cultural disjointedness of folks in the Marines and the actual combat arms, right? The sort of quote actual combat arms, traditional combat arms that are saying like, those guys aren't warfighters, they're like computer jockeys, right? And so there's a little bit of this credibility that's had to be established over the last 6 years in particular that I think has slowed down some of the funding and prevented the Space Force from articulating its mission, but they've gotten a lot better at it over the last few years.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit. What do you think the cultural perspective internally and externally looking in around the Space Force is? Because, used to hear some like really crazy kind of silly stories of like, people, I remember one particular one where there was a Space Force officer who was trying to board a plane and said, how they say in the beginning, military, active duty folks, you can kind of board, and handed, the person at the gate, like their ID, and they were like, is this a joke? Like, didn't even think that the Space Force was a thing. Now, this was years ago, mind you, right? This was kind of early days of the Space Force. Like, how has that evolved? How has that kind of cultural perspective around the Space Force evolved? I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, I've been out of uniform for 3 years, so I don't have a contemporaneous view of this. But I certainly was on the receiving end of a variety of jokes like, hey, space monkey, or hey, you want to be an astronaut? Do you guys go into space? Do you joystick the satellite? It was an education that had to happen. Like,
sure.
The challenge with the Joint Force and combat arms organizations and the Joint Force is they actually didn't understand how dependent they were on space capabilities to go do their day-to-day missions. And so for a long time, really as early as really 2012, 2013, there were a series of war games, and we can go back to what the outcomes of those war games are, to the extent that we can talk about them, that really showed the Joint Force that they were not going to be successful unless the United States achieved space superiority, independent of what service was part of doing that. And so they kind of decoupled the desired outcome of space superiority from a particular service. And then that helped everyone realize, oh, well, this is actually a really important thing. Like, in order to get carrier strike groups from point A to point B, like a lot of things in space need to change. And so, there's a Space Force that goes and does that. We need to actually go give them resources. So it's the slow burn of like conversation and relationships and war games and modeling simulation and advocacy building between the junior officer level to the frozen middle to senior leaders to Congress and then ultimately to the White House. But as far as the external perception of the Space Force, I think like a lot of people share what you just articulated. They associate it with the Netflix series, I one time, I often say that Steve Carell played somebody I know in the Space Force, which is not the kindest thing to say, but yeah, I think that's what most people see is like this kind of attempt by the United States to have galactic domination. Like it's kind of this gets tied up with this post-colonial narrative and stuff like that. That's just like not true. Instead of being about protecting joint forces. So as soon as you make the connection between like people die if X doesn't happen, it becomes a much easier thing to digest.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair to the Space Force, right? Like, space in general has this problem. It's just not just the Space Force. Like, I mean, the number of times I hear from folks like not in the industry, we're like, well, how do people, and also some investors like who haven't spent time in the space, like, how do you even make money in space? What do you do?
Yeah.
Like, why do we like, so right. It's certainly not just specific to the Space Force. That being said, what is the current state of the space arsenal for the US? Like, what capabilities do we have today, from your perspective and what you can talk about, and, where are the clearest gaps?
Yeah, this is a hard thing for me to talk about in particular because of the role that I had in the Space Force. But I can say that the China and Russia have been at this game a lot longer than the United States has. Their weapons development programs go back to at least 2007. Before that, the SC-19 shot against the Fengyun 1 Charlie was the outcome of likely a multi-year development campaign. So I'd say probably early 2003, 4, 5 is when that started as part of a deliberate effort by China to modernize their military forces and to be able to contest the United States. So they've been working on it now for 20 plus years. And 2017, when the United States declared space as a warfighting domain, was really the concerted effort to attempt to eventually align funding towards space superiority systems. And so now, into 2025, this is the first time that I've heard a general officer say explicitly that we need offensive capabilities, we need weapons for space. That happened at Space Symposium this year, which is just,
I remember that,
an extraordinary moment, obvious to people that have been in the conversation, but only now is sort of the veil of classification that has prevented rhetoric from the right things from being said, the accurate things from being said, is starting to lift. And so I would say that like that tardiness is a demonstration of not a lot of capability, not a lot of ability to deal with the problem. Sure.
Well, okay, so I want to talk to you. I want to get your take on the Space Force budget, right? It was sitting around 29-ish billion. But the recent sort of number that's come out for FY 2026 is around 26 billion. So actually a cut to the Space Force budget. What's your take on that? I mean, it's a fraction of the budget of the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. It's within throwing distance of the budget of the Marines, but certainly, a fraction of the other three. What's your take on why that is the case right now, or why cut the Space Force budget, given everything you've said so far?
So I think there are likely two things at foot here, two things at play, rather. So number one, I read this morning that the Space Force's budget will change as a function of reconciliation. So there's some fate of the Space Force's top line budget that's tied to reconciliation. The second is there's a tectonic shift that's going to happen over the next few years in the Space Force's budget, in which they have to go from supporting legacy systems, which are always going to be required, to now funding counter space capabilities and the supporting targeting infrastructure and training infrastructure. So I think we're in the middle of that shift. And that is unfortunately kind of wrapped up in reconciliation, potentially even wrapped up in Golden Dome. So I think I'm in a wait and see mode to see like what the actual true state is, because I think as of today, right, June 3rd, this is kind of a rapidly evolving situation. It's not clear to me that it reflects a lack of cognizance on the part of either Congress or the White House on the importance of space superiority. I think we're just sort of seeing the budget dance play out in real time. But I will say, like, what the Space Force needs is about $50 to $60 billion on a consistent basis to be able to build offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities, the training infrastructure, and the targeting systems for multi-domain space superiority engagements.
Well, you've said the magic words, Golden Dome, but I'm not gonna take the bait yet. We're gonna wait just a little bit. We can talk about Golden Dome. We'll definitely talk about Golden Dome. We can't not talk about Golden Dome. But I do have just a couple other questions related to sort of the current state that I'd love to get your thoughts on. So talk to me a little bit about the role of private industry. Like how has that and maybe the legacy primes, what have they done to kind of fill our space capabilities, and where do you see that kind of going? Is this going to be an area that the primes will dominate in?
So the primes are always going to have a role here. And what many defense tech CEOs talk about are actually not competing against each other. It's taking the lunch of the primes, either through partnerships or direct competition. So the primes are going to have a role, and traditionally space superiority systems have been built by the primes. Now, the problem with that is that means that there's not, if that work is happening, it is super, sort of in deep corners. It's probably classified. There's a small number of personnel by virtue of clearances that are working on those problems. It's not getting a lot of capital allocation in the broader portfolio of the primes for R&D. They're not taking a lot of capital risk to develop new products because they are waiting on the Space Force to articulate requirements, right? So that actually ends up being a strategic window for companies like True Anomaly to enter and say, we have a thesis on the technology that needs to be built as a function of the missions that the Space Force has to go do. And we provide a level of detail and sophistication and study associated with that. That's how we come to conviction about the products that we choose to go invest in. And we should talk about that process because it's super interesting. And we're taking bets on the platforms, payloads, and operating systems, the software infrastructure that's necessary to achieve space superiority. Largely, the primes are saying, we're going to wait and see. There's questions around the budget. There's questions around the directionality of the Space Force's mission. How many weapons is the Space Force going to actually go buy, or is it going to be more of the same? So we're in this transition period, which is a huge opportunity for industrial partners like True Anomaly to come in and say, we think we have an answer and we have the capital backing to go execute it and the risk profile to go do it.
Do you think
the response to that has been very positive?
Yeah, so I want to talk about that. So the procurement process, when you're talking about a domain where there's just not a lot of data, right, as it relates to military missions, right? Like how is, as a founder building in this domain, like how has it been working with the government, and do you see it as an opportunity? Because compared to if you were selling into the Air Force or the Navy, where things are very well, I should be careful what I say here, but things in general are set, is what I should say. I'll just keep it at that.
Well, there's decades, or in some cases centuries, of the expenditure of blood and treasure that has said, okay, these operational concepts work, these force packages work, these broad concepts work on the battlefield, and then you can get confidence to derive requirements, and then you can build an industrial base around that. That because the Space Force has never fought a conflict that extends into space, they have limited operational experience, as you said, Mo, and most of the experience is based on modeling, simulation, and wargaming and training, which is one of the reasons General Saltzman has really emphasized this. Like, we have to have a large percentage of TOA associated with modeling, simulation, and training and test and evaluation readiness writ large, so that Space Force operators and the acquisition community can get together and fight things out on the range or in a modeling simulation environment, figure out what works, figure out what doesn't, and then make new investments. So how does a company like True Anomaly navigate that in particular? We look at this kind of historically. We're in different parts of the development process for a new domain that look a lot like 1920 in some ways, 1936 in others, and 1947, 48 and others. So what I mean by that is we're kind of, they're mature space technologies. We've been operating in the space domain for decades now, but we're answering questions about the shortfall of the performance envelope of those systems by putting them through war games and modeling simulation campaigns. And we're finding, wait a second, these capabilities are not built for a contested environment. That begs the question, what capabilities are required for a contested environment? And that actually is the analysis process you use to generate requirements. So rather than wait for the Space Force to develop that, we brought a lot of that functionality in-house, just the way that actually any industrious member of private industry would do, right? Like you have a new product idea, you get conviction in it somehow, modeling simulation, somebody's brilliant idea, whatever, and then you invest in that and you go bring it to market. So we're doing nothing different than the rest of the public and private sector does from a product development standpoint, but our process deals with 1,000 different factors because we're having to basically build the foundational operational concepts alongside the technology. So we're having to ask questions like, what does an orbital strike look like? What does orbital sweep look like? What does area defense look like? And then how do you sort of like screen that through different threat types, different levels and sophistication of threat, different heterogeneity of that threat, different domains that threat is operating across. And that means that you have to have basically a product development and ideation organization inside of your company, which we've built over the last 2 years to say, okay, here's what we're going to go invest in first, and then here are where we think the opportunities are going to be. The opportunity there also is that the Space Force is doing this, right? So when you match up with the Space Force's conclusions, right, then you end up with this really powerful, productive, and creative exercise where you say, like, yes, we came to the same conclusion, now let's go build it together. And sometimes you introduce interesting new things.
Yeah, you're flying the plane as you're building it, if I may.
Yeah, we're like doing the 1930s interwar like exercises, like maritime equivalent exercises, where they figured out that like carrier operations are really, really important to being able to execute the types of things that we saw in World War II.
Right. Let's switch gears for a second. Let's talk about Golden Dome. How does this all fit into the Golden Dome strategy? Like, how do you think about that? Obviously, there's significant ground-based systems that are being built for Golden, or proposed, and will eventually be needed for Golden Dome. But let's talk about the space side of Golden Dome and how you think about it.
Yeah, there are really 3 elements of a space architecture that are helpful for missile defense, or as I would say, not helpful, essential for missile defense. The first is the sensing layers, the ability to detect infrared signatures from boosting missiles and from the hypersonic glide vehicles activity through the atmosphere. There is the communications layer, which allows for different sensors to communicate with each other and to shooters to be able to say, okay, I have this piece of information, I have this piece of information, let's fuse those together and do a picture of the battle space and select which shooter is appropriate to take a shot at a ballistic missile or a hypersonic glide vehicle at different phases of its engagement. And then finally, there's interceptors. So kinetic interceptors or different types of weapons that can be deployed in the space domain to strike a hypersonic glide vehicle or ballistic missile in its flight profile before it gets to its target. So those are the 3 major interventions that the space domain can provide in that problem set. For the first time in 20 years, we're talking again about the development of, by we, I mean the industry and the government are talking about the development of space-based interceptors designed explicitly to target systems in their boost phase. So the reason you want to go after missiles in their boost phase is because that's when, other than when they're on the ground, is largely when they're most vulnerable before they deploy countermeasures, before they deploy decoys and multiple warheads, and certainly before a hypersonic glide vehicle gets released and starts to re-enter the atmosphere and kind of go through its aerothermodynamic flight process.
Evan, could you just define what it means for a missile to be in its boost phase?
Yeah. So there's generally 3 phases of a ballistic missile's flight. There's boost phase when the rockets on that ballistic missile light and stages separate and you get it basically into with the right exit velocity and the right altitude to be able to get to its target, right? So you think you're throwing a baseball between, the pitcher's mound and outfield, you're on a ballistic trajectory. That boost phase for a ballistic interceptor is kind of the throw by the pitcher. Mm-hmm. So the mid-course phase, which is the after boost phase, is where the missile is in coast, right? It's probably changing its trajectory a little bit, but it's largely just flying towards its target. And in terminal phase, especially for high altitude systems or long range systems like ICBMs and IRBMs that do go exo-atmospheric, terminal phase is the re-entry phase. So you're re-entering the atmosphere and you're doing terminal guidance towards your target. So receiving in-flight target updates or and actuating flight surfaces or DAC systems to strike your target.
Got it. Okay, so you were saying earlier, so for Golden Dome, or I guess missile defense systems in general, you want to be intercepting the missile at its boost phase.
That's the ideal. That's right. So now the challenge is, so imagine that was the goal. Right? You have a choice. You can try to do that from a subsurface interceptor, subsurface to like in the maritime domain. You could do that from a surface interceptor. You could do that from a land interceptor or an aerial interceptor. But the problem is you can't get those systems close enough to the launcher, right? The transporter, erector launcher. So the best domain to do that from is space.
Got it. Okay. If you were advising the Pentagon on the capabilities to prioritize right now, considering also Golden Dome, like what would you say the U.S. needs now versus later?
All in on space-based interceptors.
Yeah. I
also communications.
Yeah, well,
communications is the most important thing.
Tell me a little bit about let's actually talk about True Anomaly here for a second. Tell me a little bit about what how you guys fit into Golden Dome. Like, what are you thinking about? What's your contribution? What will be your contribution to it?
We're thinking about the entire space layer. So comm systems, sensing systems, and then interceptors. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. When you think about sort of what to build today versus what can wait, tell me a little bit about that. Obviously, like there's, we would love all of it, now, but like what do we have to kind of prioritize versus having more of a long-term kind of ambition?
For space superiority
correct. For just space superiority.
Yeah. The first thing is, and these are just my opinions, but this is rooted in modeling, simulation, analysis that we've done. The first thing is you need a robust sensor network in space that allows you to maintain custody of targets, broad awareness, surveillance of the space domain from low Earth orbit out and beyond cislunar space. That sensing infrastructure isn't just about discovery or the tracking of known objects. It also needs to be capable of discovery of new objects, the maintenance of the catalog and tracking, knowledge of those targets. That all needs to be able to lead to a fire control solution so that you can employ capabilities defensively or offensively against targets in the space domain. So we often have, in the past, we've approached this problem through the lens of space traffic management, right? Which is akin to what the FAA does when they're preventing airliner, or when they're moving airliners, across the country. That is just about deconfliction and just about guidance. It's not about this threat came out of this airfield and it's carrying these capabilities, and now I need to guide an intercepting aircraft to go deal with that threat before that threat's able to deploy its munitions. That's the problem that we have to go solve in space. It's not space traffic management. That's a problem that we do need to solve as well, because there's a lot of stuff that we lose track of all the time, or space debris. So there's sensitivity problems in the existing space domain awareness architecture, but we need to move that architecture to fire control. So that means broad surveillance nets plus tracking systems where there's enough of them to be able to deal with multiple simultaneous threats in an active engagement. And then to be able to tie that into a battle management command and control architecture that can do the weapon target pairing and do the awareness and defensive threat reaction kind of calls and things like that you see in other domains. The next piece is you need active defensive capabilities, and you need systems that are attritable and low cost. So you have to be able to field an architecture that is inexpensive enough to feel comfortable deploying. This is true for the SDA architecture as well. That creates a cost imposition, asymmetric cost imposition for your adversary in every single orbital domain. And then you need to be able to bring the fight to the enemy too.
When do you think we'll see the first Guardian in space?
We already have. There was an astronaut that I think transitioned into the Space Force from the Air Force.
Got it. Okay, I didn't realize that. Flew to space as a Guardian.
Or became a Guardian on board the International Space Station.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize
I think
that.
this happened like when True Anomaly started. So like my knowledge of events that don't have to do with the DoD and the intelligence community are like basically zero.
Yeah.
Ask me anything about Love Is Blind, and I could not tell you.
Okay. Let's actually just let me ask the question more strategically, which is like, what do you think there's going to be a long-term need to have Guardians in space at all time? Do you see a scenario where that's going to be the case, or largely, we're building sort of an autonomous future?
I think it's going to be both, but I think that future is probably 50 plus years out.
You said 50, 50?
50, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's dependent. I think that's realistic. I think it's dependent on a burgeoning and self-sustaining infrastructure and set of commercial activities in the space domain, where the focus on terrestrial competition becomes just one part of broader resource competition associated with between the United States and great powers, and I think that plays out in space. Probably the best analogy for something that it could look like in a couple hundred years, hopefully not, would be like the Expanse, right, where you do have military forces protecting lines of communication and commerce in space.
Man, so we're not going to see like for all mankind style weapons on the moon anytime soon. It sounds like.
No, I think that is definitely in the future. I just think it's probably not 5 years from now.
Yeah. Well, yeah. What do you think about the moon and Mars, and how does that play into strategy?
There's a ton of really interesting applications for space domain awareness and space control from the moon. The orbital environment, the low gravitational orbital environment of cislunar space allows you to deploy capabilities from that environment into a really wide variety of inclinations around the Earth. That creates a space domain awareness problem for adversaries. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to use that for the purposes of surprise. I think the lunar resource question still remains to be seen. I think what's going to drive the United States to do anything like interesting in the moon at the moon from a government prioritization perspective, independent of industry, is really going to be competition with China. And China is starting to deploy, and have been for the past several years, like a lot of capability in lunar orbit on the surface of the moon as well. So I think you'll see a desire by the U.S. government to at least match China, and at the very least try to understand what their intentions are.
Let's kind of jump back to True Anomaly. You've had a couple missions so far. How did this go? What have you learned from them? Like, what's next? I know you have another mission coming up this fall. You've raised all this capital. What are sort of the next moves for the company?
Yeah, so we're rounding out our flight test campaign for Jackal. Jackal is a different beast than a traditional satellite that is designed to look at the surface of the Earth or perform communications or whatever the traditional operational set is for systems. Just like you don't send a 737 to an air-to-air engagement, or you don't ask it to drop bombs, mission drives design, right? There's a reason that we have fighters. There's a reason that we have long-range bombers. The operational environment and the threat drive design decisions for the spacecraft. So Jackal is explicitly designed for space-to-space engagements for the purpose of space superiority. That means it has a ton of maneuverability. It has compact avionics. It has excess power. It has a level of structural stiffness that's required for rapid maneuverability and agility in multiple axes, both in rotation and in translation. And it has a wide payload carrying capacity because it's intended to be a multi-role, multi-mission space-to-space engagement platform for reconnaissance, et cetera. So there's a lot of design challenges with that. We took the approach very early on of just going straight for the full performance of the system and iterating off the back of that kind of baseline set of performance characteristics. Because we didn't need to build new physics for this. Like, there wasn't anything that was kind of foundationally that needed to be broken through. It was really an integration challenge between hardware and software, plus like a structures and propulsion challenge. And so our first mission, we kind of got one step. In our second mission, we got like 10 steps. And now we're looking forward to taking the next set of steps with the next mission that's coming up at the end of this year. And so that is intended to be the debut of Jackal. We're confident we'll make some awesome progress there, but we're taking the same approach that many great new space and aerospace companies do, which is like keep expectations low and get excited when things get excited when you exceed those expectations. But we're coming up on some significant milestones from a contractual standpoint and from a customer development standpoint. So we've been selected to execute a program called Victus Haze, which is the first full end-to-end operational demonstration for tactically responsive space. So we are laser focused on executing that.
When are you going to be attaching an offensive kinetic capability to Jackal?
I'm going to skip that question.
I figured you would.
Not anytime soon.
What's sort of the next kind of what's the vision for the company goes next? And I mean like physically goes next. Geo, kind of cislunar. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, in this order, it's low Earth orbit, cislunar, and then geo. And we haven't announced the cislunar and geo missions yet, so I'll keep a lid on that one for now. But I'll get back to you, Mo.
And then maybe just as we wrap here, tell us a little bit about the impact that you ultimately hope True Anomaly has, not just commercially, but strategically for the U.S.
Yeah. First of all, I will measure success by the number of missions that my former colleagues are able to execute with Mosaic and with Jackal. We spent some time talking about Jackal, but Mosaic is really the backbone of what we have to offer for software-defined tactics and software-defined hardware and operational concepts. So I will measure success by whether they're able to reliably and effectively use our products to achieve mission objectives, and not just the mission objectives that they've been able to achieve before, but are starting to expand the performance envelope and discover new operational concepts that will ultimately lead to a fighting chance at deterrence and space superiority. So we've started with Jackal, we've started with Mosaic, but ultimately we want to build a family of systems across a variety of engagement phenomenologies to achieve every operational concept that the Space Force is going to have to deal with in deterrence and in combat operations. So we are just getting started with Jackal and Mosaic. Our goal is to be the dominant defense prime for space superiority, full stop. And we're doing that by focusing on that problem and not spreading across multiple domains.
Amazing. I do want to end with a maybe slightly controversial topic that neither of us will know for sure, but maybe we'll have some predictions. Let's talk about NASA just to end. NASA is just, we had some pretty big news with Isaacman. There's a bit of uncertainty around who, at least uncertainty from the public's perspective on who's going to end up leading NASA and what is the future of NASA. NASA historically has really, really avoided, at least publicly, ever associating themselves, what they do with defense and military. And in fact, we've invited them to speak at certain panels and in the past, or work on some content, but it kind of ends with like civil, right? Science exploration. Do you foresee a future for NASA that, and we don't know who the administrator is going to be, but could there be an administrator that kind of starts to blend sort of the lines between sort of civil and military? Like, what do you think about that? And is that something that you think is necessary, or should they be separate?
I think they should be separate. The goals of NASA, as one of the most important contributions that NASA has made, is in planetary exploration and earth sciences. And those have to be different. They have different priorities, different technologies. At the same time, NASA is part of the expression of the United States political power and kind of power with a capital P. So there might be a future in which those mission sets bifurcate, where human space flight for the purposes of not science missions, but human spaceflight for the purposes of the expansion of U.S. power end up being differentiated enough to necessitate a different office relative to kind of the pure exploratory aspect that I think is really critical for NASA. I mean, that is the images and the science and the ideas and insights that those missions generate are the reason that kids go get engineering degrees and science degrees, and are the reason that I got into space. So I think it's critical and has to sustain, and we'll see. I mean, I think we'll see over the next few years whether there is some bifurcation that makes sense there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Evan, pleasure to have you on the show. You're extremely knowledgeable about this topic, so it's always great to hear you speak about it. I've heard you talk about this about strategy and doctrine and sort of the future of the Space Force a number of different times, and it's always a treat. So thanks for coming on the show and spending an hour with us to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for the time, man. Appreciate it.
Until next time.